So the government is buying what? Crypto. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. I think it's fascinating that the government is starting a Bitcoin and crypto reserve, something that has never obviously happened in the history of the United States, but creates some interesting dynamics. So I want to get into that today.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing to talk about because you say those words and people think a thousand different things. Oh, we're already in debt. How are we going to be buying crypto? Should we be buying crypto in the first place? Lots of questions bouncing around. This is something that has been talked about a lot, but formally announced by Donald Trump in March. And so we're really in the early innings of seeing where this is going to go. So it's going to be a really interesting journey, but also, excited to take a look at what's happening now and how it's really going to play out.
Yeah, and I think it begs the question, why are we getting to this phase? And I think is the US government really wants to look at Bitcoin and the broader cryptocurrency space, but specifically Bitcoin as a strategic asset, just like gold, just like oil. Right now, those are the two, if you want to call them commodity, reserves. Bitcoin's more of a digital commodity, but similar in that respect is that we have an oil reserve, we have a gold reserve. And those serve individual purposes. And being interested in becoming, a leader in the digital currency space, the government's taking that next step saying, hey, we want to really lend some credibility to Bitcoin here and broader cryptocurrencies. And so we're going to start this reserve fund, starting to stockpile some Bitcoin. I think that's just fascinating that they're taking that step in the first place.
And I think one thing that's really interesting about this and very important to highlight for, a lot of people, including myself, I didn't realize this for a long time, is there aren't going to be additional government purchases of Bitcoin. The government comes into Bitcoin in a lot of different ways. Most notably, most people think about, criminal activity. They'll seize assets from criminals who, acquired it, through hacks or is using it to facilitate transactions of illegal goods. So they collect a lot of Bitcoin just through the, general business of the government. And what's traditionally been happening is we've been selling it more or less at spot market, just as we get it, just kind of selling it through. And I think the government's realizing, hey, this is a good opportunity to create a separate fund and just hold on to it because it's an appreciating asset that we don't need to sell at any random given point because it, ebbs and flows. It goes high and low pretty regularly. And so you don't want to seize a whole bunch from a big criminal organization and then sell it at, artificially depressed prices or, something where you hold on to it for another year or two. There are going to be some much better selling opportunities.
I think that's the interesting part is how they're going to interact with the market in holding this Bitcoin. And it sounds like they're going to be relatively passive holders, just like they are in the gold market. Now, we've seen different things in the oil market. For example, the SBR has been used to help shore up oil prices or really bring them down in situations where oil got a little bit too high. Gold, they've remained more passive. So the gold that's in Fort Knox has not really been traded on the open market, but does provide a strategic asset for the US government in any case where there was broader geopolitical instability or they needed it to kind of help shore up the currency. And so we don't expect them to be really doing a lot of market operations with the Bitcoin that they hold. But I think it is certainly lending a lot of credibility to the space. And the US government right now has something like 200,000 Bitcoin, so over $20 billion. That's pretty small compared to the 7 to 800 billion in gold that they have, but it's certainly a start. When Fort Knox opened and they started storing gold there, of course they didn't have hundreds of billions of dollars of gold quite yet, but we expect that Bitcoin to continue to rise, both in its individual value as a cryptocurrency and just the amount stockpiled by the U.S. government.
Yeah, exactly. So the U.S. government's not really going to be a net buyer out there. We'll get to other net buying activity in the future. But, this is removing selling pressure from the markets, which is really interesting to see. And then similarly, the U.S. is going to establish a more broad digital asset stockpile. So this is going to be anything else that they seize in, similar situations that just isn't Bitcoin, Ethereum, XRP, yada, 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 thousands of other coins that they come into the government, and instead of just selling all of it. They're just going to stockpile it, give them some more flexibility over what they're going to do.
I think something else that's interesting about this is that it's going to be managed by the Treasury. So all of a sudden, Scott Bessent has a new job. Not only does he do the day-to-day Treasury operations, he's now a trade ambassador. He's also going to be helping to manage the cryptocurrency reserves. But I think probably the most fascinating part about this is that it will be publicly visible on the Bitcoin ledger. So any individual, you or I, can look essentially online and see exactly how much Bitcoin the US government holds, along with the other cryptocurrencies, of course, but Bitcoin being the most notable one. That's going to be very visible. Whereas, throughout, recent history, there hasn't necessarily been an audit, or you can't go to Fort Knox and count the number of gold bars that they have there. But every single day, the amount of Bitcoin that the US government holds will be visible. And that's pretty fascinating to me.
Yeah, it wasn't too long ago I saw one U.S. government representative telling another one that, oh, trust us, the gold is there. I've seen it. It's totally there. Here we can all see it. It's all visible, accountable. And then there's, no leniency for, moving it without telling the American people.
Yeah. Also, to their credit, it's a lot easier to count Bitcoin when you just have to look once online than count through thousands and weigh thousands of gold bars. But I digress there.
So we've talked about the federal government, but there are also state level initiatives going on. Victor, do you want to tell us about that? Just kind of give us the overview there.
Yeah. So it's not only a federal government situation, you also have a few states have already started to set up crypto reserves specifically for Bitcoin and, or most notably Bitcoin. But New Hampshire, Texas, here in Texas, Arizona have all set up crypto reserves. And whenever you have states that have a surplus, there's a different dynamic here, because if you have a surplus in your budget the way that Texas does, they can actually buy Bitcoin on the open market. So unlike the federal government that's just seizing it through federal crimes and things like that, well, a state like Texas or New Hampshire or Arizona could actually be buying Bitcoin on the open market as a part of their own treasury. So it creates a new kind of price dynamic as far as how we're thinking about is impacting Bitcoin's price.
Yeah, and that's something interesting to point out, because Texas and New Hampshire both have, surpluses. So they're going to be investing funds, saving for the future. Arizona, theirs is set up purely passively like the federal government. So it's going to be that, kind of passive accumulation. Hey, we're going to hold on to this instead of just selling it, but not actively accumulating it.
And I think that gets us to, between the state level crypto assets, their reserves, and then the federal reserves, what is the rationale for this? We mentioned at the top of the episode, but I think especially the US government, the Trump administration made this a point in their campaign when they're running for office, that they want to be crypto friendly, crypto forward. They want the US to be a hub for innovation in the digital asset space. I mean, we're really getting outpaced, especially by Europe and international economies in the crypto space. A lot of companies were deciding to set up operations, build new applications, especially in the decentralized finance space that, is very interesting to you and I, being, traditional markets operators. And the Trump administration, the US government now really wants to bring that back to the United States. So I think this is kind of one of those first steps in that process, is lending a lot of credibility to cryptocurrencies and, starting that step and saying, hey, we want to be a hub for that here in the United States.
Yeah. And it's interesting to see because, the US is such a tech forward country and economy as a whole, as we've seen with the, from the tariffs onwards. It's because we have gone so tech heavy and not manufacturing heavy. And so not having one of the most frontier tech industries in America anymore is really an abnormal thing. And so I think the administration sees that it's an easy thing to reshore because we have so much talent here in America that's interested in this, but has been hamstrung by SEC and government activities, previously from operating these businesses here. And so it's going to be interesting looking forward because it's going to, like you said, lend additional credibility to crypto and really Bitcoin mainly, but also encourage other countries to kind of do similar things. We're already seeing a lot of other countries, especially developing countries who have had currency troubles, try and establish Bitcoin reserves or peg themselves to Bitcoin in some way to kind of validate their currency. We've seen this really historically, people doing this with the US dollar, trying to accumulate US dollars and either run on US dollars or peg their own currency to US dollars. But now it's kind of creating an environment for people to do a same or similar thing with Bitcoin instead.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the currency aspect because that's something that's super notable here. And is interesting that the US government is lending credibility to a currency that is not necessarily, that's not really its own. It's not controlled by any government authority. It's international. It's easy to transfer between individuals. And historically, I mean, for the last, couple hundred years, a lot of trade has been predominantly in US dollars. And especially in our modern trading system is most assets, we talked about this on a recent podcast about currency in the US dollar, but it's all been centered around US dollar denominated goods. And now you're giving a little bit of credibility to something that can be used instead of the US dollar, which could create some interesting dynamics for countries that are operating who, like you said, have currency troubles. They may be starting to try to use Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies more than just necessarily backing everything in US dollars. But it definitely kind of begs the question, really starts that conversation.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, that's a really recent podcast where we talked about foreign exchange and foreign trade, but we didn't really address the crypto aspect of it, where we use the example of Brazil trading with China, denominating that in US dollars because the currency dynamics there. Not to rehash that whole example, but they could just as easily, if not more easily, use Bitcoin instead of dollars because you don't have to go to a US bank, the US Treasury, accumulate dollars in order to exchange that. Bitcoin, it's all online, all relatively instant. So really the ease of use would go up too, along with that.
And I think that's also the interesting part of it is that right now, if an individual country, say it's China or, any other global economic power says, hey, I want to do trade in my currency. Well, obviously they have a vested interest in that. But if you have any number of countries say, hey, I want to use a decentralized currency that's not attached to anybody, there's not really that argument against it saying, oh, you just want this for your own good and to benefit you or to hurt the United States necessarily. Now, taking a step back, I think we're a long way from something like this happening, but it'll be interesting to see if we see more international, transfers of cryptocurrency and potentially attempts to start using it for something like trade.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think it's going to be a US trading in Bitcoin so much as other countries, hey, we can get rid of this risk because every foreign exchange, every currency has risk to it. And it's, interesting because you kind of view some things as stable, but there's really no anchor point for currencies. They're all just kind of floating along, doing what they'll do. And if dollars are your reserve asset, you're still exposed to what the US government's doing. If Bitcoin are your reserve asset, you're still exposed to the swings in Bitcoin because that's a very real thing that happens. But it just allows for further diversification of these countries' reserves, and especially for those, kind of developing economies where they might not have a lot of reserves and don't want to put kind of all their eggs in one basket because they don't have many eggs.
Right. Absolutely. Now, this is an investing podcast. I want to talk through some of the investment implications for this. Hunter, you want to get us started on what the price dynamics are? We, kind of noted that it's going to be, net bullish for Bitcoin, but if you want to break that down a little bit.
Yeah. So, I mean, really the main driver here is that you have the government accumulating Bitcoin. So that's not going to be additional buying pressure. That's not going to directly raise the price of Bitcoin. However, as they accumulate it, as they take it out of circulation, this is, Bitcoin that they would have sold otherwise. It's Bitcoin that won't be actively transacted, like you mentioned. So that will add, kind of positive pressure to the price. And then on the other hand, you have states like Texas and New Hampshire who will be actively buying it with their account surpluses. And so that will be positive price pressure. So net on net, it's all bullish. but the only like direct market activity we're really going to be seeing is through those states.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's worth noting for, any of our listeners who are not familiar that Bitcoin has a fixed supply. It's at 21 million Bitcoin. Now, it's I think somewhere around 2 or 3 million of that has been permanently lost at this point, and even a couple more are not necessarily circulating. So, but to get to the point is that it is a fixed supply. So if you have a lot of that taken off the table, exactly to your point, and what is not, floating and transacting, then you have fewer Bitcoin out there for the market to acquire if somebody wants to go and buy some, which is going to lead to that upward price pressure. So I think those dynamics are interesting. Granted, we're not talking about huge investments into Bitcoin right now. It's over $1 trillion asset right now. And it would take a lot more than 200,000 or what we noted earlier, $20 billion reserve in order to really influence the price upward. But it definitely creates some upward pressure. So from an investment perspective, I think that's kind of the direction that we're looking at. But probably what I would say is the more important point is just the lending of credibility to crypto. I mean, you have a lot of institutional investors, legacy investors, your older investors who are not as crypto native like the next generation is, that really don't understand cryptocurrency. They don't see the value in it. And so maybe this changes some minds when it comes to, hey, should I be investing in this asset class? Because all of a sudden the US government's lending some credibility to it.
Well, and then also for, like I've kind of been talking about, your emerging economies and other global powers, with a lot of things we've seen where the U.S. walks, the rest of the world follows in a lot of respects. And I think Bitcoin could very easily be one of those things where, okay, the U.S. government currently has 200,000 Bitcoin. Well, maybe the EU picks up some, Russia trying to diversify, get around sanctions, whatever it may be, they pick up some. And I think it kind of creates a snowball of foreign governments acknowledging the use case for international trade, but also just the FX diversification of it. So, that 200,000 in the US could turn into a couple million pretty easily.
Right. Now, I want to really bring it home. You and I work on a daily basis constructing portfolios for our clients, doing investment research, talking about how crypto can play a role in one's portfolio. I think that we would argue that it is a valuable asset class from a diversification standpoint. Now, we would never argue that you should be putting huge amounts of your savings or huge amounts of your liquid net worth into Bitcoin. But the good thing is it has become a much easier asset class to get invested in today. You don't have to worry about private keys and storing your crypto on chain and worrying about the supply chain and logistics of managing that yourself. You can buy a spot ETF that right now you've got the Bitcoin ETF and the Ethereum ETF. Both of those are extremely safe. They're insured. You can hold it at your custodian. It creates very easy access. And so I think, you and I would both say that we argue for, a reasonable position in each of those cryptocurrencies.
Yeah, it's a good alternative asset. I mean, it's one more diversifier, excuse me. And, it's, if we want to talk about value of Bitcoin just as a utility, as a currency, we've talked about it before, but it's been a while, that there's value to the chain. If you can get value through being able to transact internationally, then that's a valuable thing. Whether or not a Bitcoin, you can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't feel it, so it might not feel valuable to anyone who's not part of the ecosystem, but there is real value to be gained. The financial system makes lots of money for a reason. JP Morgan is a huge company for a reason. They transact, billions, trillions of dollars, and, people are willing to pay for that. Visa, MasterCard make huge margins on, unrelated transactions because there's value to being able to transact those dollars. So you have that inherent value to Bitcoin, and then the value it can bring to a portfolio. On top of that is, again, as an alternative asset diversifier. Really, really like it, in, like you said, in moderation, just as another another step to building a balanced portfolio. And I think this global attention and global adoption is really going to go a long way, to making it an even bigger asset than it is.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, every financial situation is different, right? I think if anybody's considering investment, consult someone like ourselves to, make sure that makes sense before doing it. But to all the points that you just mentioned, I think there is some value there for most investors. It probably makes some sense. And, I hope our listeners gain something from today's conversation. I can't believe we're sitting here saying the U.S. government's going to be holding Bitcoin, but here we are.
Yeah, if you told me that 4 years ago, I would not believe you. But things change quickly these days. So exciting to watch and see how it all unfolds.
Absolutely. Thanks, Hunter.
Thanks, Victor.